Welcome back. Today, we're diving into an incredibly detailed explainer on something that has fundamentally hardwired the world we live in today. We're tracking the Roman Empire, its chronological rise, its absolute peak, and its terrifying unraveling. We'll trace the exact leadership shifts, the massive territorial expansion, and those deep, systemic failures that ultimately brought the western half of this absolute superpower to its knees, plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this journey. 1. The fall of the Republic. 2. Birth of the Empire. 3. The Pax Romana Peak. 4. The crisis of the 3rd century. 5. Division and decline. And 6. The final collapse. Let's jump right into Section 1. Fall of the Republic, the end of an era. So you have to remember, the Republic wasn't some modern nation-state. It was essentially this complex, delicate network of self-ruled towns. They were governed by annually elected magistrates, mostly the consuls, working alongside the Senate. But by the 1st century BC, centuries of that tradition just buckled. Severe political violence, constant military upheaval, it all paved the way for centralized, single-person, autocratic rule. And what's really striking is how incredibly fast this happened once the dominoes started falling. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar makes himself perpetual dictator and is almost immediately assassinated. 2 years later, his assassins are crushed at Philippi by Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian. But, that alliance was never going to last. Octavian takes out Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, and then boom, by 27 BC, the Senate officially recognizes Octavian's overarching authority, crowning him Augustus and giving him absolute power. Which perfectly sets up Section 2, Birth of the Empire, Engineering Power. The absolute bedrock of the emperor's rule comes down to this one Roman legal concept, imperium. It literally means command, usually in a military sense. So when the Senate granted Augustus proconsular imperium in 27 BC, they were effectively giving him command over all the provinces and every single army inside them. He superseded everyone. The Republic? It was just a name at that point. Augustus was pulling all the strings. And he backed up that power by completely restructuring the military. It transitioned into a force of 20-year full-time volunteer professionals. The legions were highly standardized, right around 5,000 men, complete with their own integrated engineers and logistics. But the real genius? The auxiliary forces. We're talking over 100,000 non-citizens who were granted full Roman citizenship after 25 years of service. It was a massive integration machine. And even when disaster struck, like losing 3 whole legions in the Teutoburg forest ambush in 9 AD, Rome didn't fold. They just restructured, maintaining around 30 legions. But here is a truly mind-bending demographic fact. Rome managed to hold down a civilization of tens of millions of people with an active military that made up just 2% of adult males. That's it, about 300,000 soldiers in the 1st century. They weren't controlling the known world with sheer numbers, they were doing it through absolutely unparalleled organization and discipline.
All right, moving into Section 3. The Pax Romana Peak, Centuries of Stability.
To put things in perspective, by 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the empire was at its absolute territorial max, 5 million square kilometers. It stretched all the way from the rainy borders of northern England down to the sun-baked Euphrates in Syria. They completely circled the Mediterranean Sea. They literally just called it Mare Nostrum, RC. But how do you govern that? It's honestly fascinating how impossibly small their bureaucracy was. During the Five Good Emperors era, they maintained stability by adopting heirs based on strict merit, not biology. And to rule a population of anywhere from 55 to over 100 million people, Rome only sent out about 160 provincial officials a year. 160. They essentially outsourced the day-to-day taxes and order to local elites. And then the ultimate masterstroke. In 212 AD, the Constitutio Antoniana granted universal citizenship to all freeborn inhabitants. So the big takeaway here is Rome's pragmatic tolerance. They didn't just conquer you, they absorbed you. As long as you paid your taxes, kept the peace, and did the basic civic rituals acknowledging the emperor, they largely ignored your local religions and customs. Being Roman was about shared civic life, not your native bloodline. But, as we know, things take a turn. Section 4. Crisis of the 3rd century. The unraveling begins. The historian Cassius Dio really hit the nail on the head when Emperor Commodus took power in 180 AD. He described it as a plunge from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron. The Pax Romana was officially dead. Which begs the question, how does a tightly wound superpower of 100 million people actually start falling apart? Well, it's never just one thing, right? It's a compounding cascade of systemic shocks. Let's break down the failures that nearly wiped Rome off the map entirely. It essentially compounded through 4 agonizing steps. First, Commodus comes in, acts completely erratically, and wrecks the merit-based succession system. When he's assassinated, we hit step 2, decades of explosive military coups and political assassinations. Step 3, to keep paying off those angry armies, emperors started rapidly debasing the currency, which triggered massive inflation and crashed the credit markets. And then step 4, right when they are at their absolute weakest politically and economically, devastating plagues sweep through, and massive barbarian invasions start fracturing the borders. This entire nightmare period from 235 to 284 AD is what we call the crisis of the 3rd century. To survive, they had to make some drastic, permanent changes. Section 5. Division and decline, fracturing the foundation. You can clearly trace how the center of gravity inexorably shifted east. In 284 AD, Diocletian finally admits the empire is just too massive for one guy, so he splits it into 4 regions, the Tetrarchy. Then, in 330 AD, Constantine does the unthinkable and moves the primary capital out of Rome entirely, establishing Constantinople. By 380 AD, Nicene Christianity becomes the state religion. And finally, in 395 AD, the empire hits a permanent, irreversible administrative split between East and West. And the differences between the two halves became incredibly stark. You have the Western Empire, speaking Latin, shuffling its capitals around to places like Mediolanum and Ravenna, just completely buckling under economic strain and mass migration. And then you have the Eastern Empire, operating in Greek, ruling from the ultra-wealthy, heavily fortified Constantinople. It totally stabilized, which is exactly why the West disintegrated by 476 AD and the East survived for another 1,000 years, until 1453. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, the final collapse, the fall of the West. The deepest, most tragic irony of the Western Empire's collapse is that its greatest historical strength, its ability to integrate outsiders, became its fatal vulnerability. Facing massive migrations, often pushed by the Huns, the West assimilated way too many Germanic peoples, whose loyalties were, well, highly dubious. Rome didn't really fall to a single dramatic outside blow. It essentially dismembered itself from the inside out. The definitive end arrived in 476 AD. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer simply deposed the very last Western emperor, a kid named Romulus Augustulus. And Odoacer didn't even bother taking the title of Western emperor for himself. He literally just packed up the imperial insignia, mailed it off to the surviving emperor in the east, and ruled Italy himself. Just like that, the Western state was gone. Yet the tools Rome used to build its power, they completely outlasted the legions. Spoken Latin evolved into the Romance languages we use today. Roman law became the foundational template for Western jurisprudence, including the Napoleonic Code. Roman engineering fundamentally shaped the architecture of the Renaissance, and those early republican institutions, they directly inspired the democratic republics all over the globe today. So I'm going to leave you with this. Every time you look at a Roman numeral, or speak a word with Latin roots, or drive down a perfectly straight road, think about it. If Roman roads, laws, and languages are the invisible architecture beneath us today, are we still living inside an empire that never quite ended? Thanks for joining me on this chronological journey.